Hi, I'm Carter Wilson, and welcome to Motivations for Writers. So, today I want to talk about something that I see a lot, especially in developing writers, and that is the profound urge to be clever. Clever dialogue, clever descriptions, clever observations, clever turns of phrase. And at first glance, it feels like a good instinct. You want your writing to stand out. You want readers to notice the language. You want them to pause and think, that's a great line. But there's such a hidden danger in that instinct because cleverness, more often than not, is distracting. It pulls the reader out of the story instead of pulling them deeper into it. When I'm reading manuscripts, one of the most common things I encounter is language that feels like it's performing. It's trying to impress the reader instead of simply allowing the character to experience the moment. And the best storytelling isn't really about impressive sentences. I think it's about emotional connection. Readers don't stay with a story because the author wrote something witty. They stay because they recognize something human in the characters. They feel something. They see themselves in the hesitation, the insecurity, the anger, the fear. And most of the time, clever writing can interrupt that connection. What it does is it creates a layer between the reader and the character. And in my experience, one of the places this shows up most often is description. So let's say you're writing in first person present tense. You have your protagonist walking into a room. And they look around and they see other people, and suddenly everyone in that room receives a full physical description: height, clothing, hair color, facial structure, maybe even some poetic observation about their posture or the way the light hits their face. And if you're writing this scene, I want you to ask yourself a question: is this actually how you move through the world? When you walk into a room, do you catalog every person visually in your head? Do you compose little paragraphs about their appearance? Of course not. Of course you notice certain things. Something catches your attention, something feels off, something reminds you of someone else, or you barely register people at all because your mind is focused elsewhere. Real perception is selective. It's emotional. And when writing mimics that natural flow of perception, the story feels authentic. But when description becomes exhaustive, it often feels artificial. It feels like the author stepping forward and saying, "Look at this great sentence I wrote." Another place cleverness shows up is dialogue. Writers sometimes try to make every line of dialogue sharp, witty, or memorable. But real dialogue isn't always memorable. Real dialogue is messy. People interrupt each other. They avoid questions. They talk around things. They say something simple when they're feeling something complicated. And I'm telling you, that's where the power lives. No, you don't want to mimic actual human conversation to the extent that it's going to be boring. But it should be fractured. There should be things left unsaid. There should be hesitation. Lines that sound ordinary but carry emotional weight. A lot of TV shows employ clever dialogue, and sometimes It serves them well because that's the nature of the show. But at other times, you sit there watching and start to realize, wait, nobody really talks like this. No two people are clever enough to have such sharp lines one after another. And if the show is about something deep and dramatic, and that dialogue starts to feel like a performance, it begins to lose authenticity. And the same thing can happen with description that tries to be beautiful all the time. Now, of course, I'm not advocating against beautiful writing, but I think we have to define what that beautiful writing is. There's a difference between beauty that serves the moment and beauty that draws attention to itself. If the reader pauses to admire the sentence, they've momentarily stopped inhabiting the character's experience. And for that split second, the spell breaks. This becomes even more important when you're writing in a close point of view, first person, close third. In those perspectives, everything on the page should feel filtered through the character's consciousness, not the author's desire to impress. You're writing the character's perception, their priorities, their emotional state. If your protagonist is anxious, they're probably not crafting elegant metaphors about the furniture in the room. If they're angry, they're probably not carefully observing the architectural details of the building they just walked into. I see this a lot in action scenes. Two characters are in a potential battle to the death, and yet the protagonist, who's part of the battle, has these long internal passages, thoughts about life and death. In that kind of situation, they would not be thinking so clearly. They would be frantic. Now, I'll tell you something about my own process. When I write a first draft, I put everything in. I don't really censor myself much in that stage. If a line comes to me that sounds interesting or a description feels vivid, yeah, I'll leave it in. My goal in a first draft is to simply get the entire story on the page. But when I go back through the manuscript in revision, that's when I start looking for places where the writing feels like it's trying too hard. And I will tell you, those lines stand out immediately. They're often sentences that sound great on their own. They might even be clever. But when you really look at them in the context of the scene, they're doing something unhelpful. They're calling attention to themselves. Or they're slowing the reader down. Or they're saying something in a complicated way that could be said more clearly. And sometimes there are sentences that sound impressive but don't actually make much sense when you pause to think about them. And that's a big trap, especially for suspense authors. Writers sometimes fall in love with a line because it sounds poetic or clever. But if reader has to stop and untangle the sentence in order to understand it, you've broken the rhythm of the story. You never want the reader stepping outside the narrative just to decipher what you meant. Because every time that happens, the immersion weakens. So in revision, I'm often asking myself just a simple question. Is this sentence helping the reader move through the story? Or is it making them pause for the wrong reason? If it's the second one, it gets cut. And sometimes that means deleting a line I actually like, maybe even love. But clarity and emotional connection matter far more than clever phrasing. Think about the books you love. What happens when you read them? The writing itself often just disappears. Not because it's weak, but because it's so aligned with the character's experience that the reader forgets there's an author behind it. They're just there, inside the moment, inside the tension, inside the emotional reality of the story. And that's the goal. Not admiration, but immersion. Think about your favorite books. Are you remembering them because of the writing? Or is the story just lodged in your soul? So the next time you're revising a scene, pay attention to moments where the writing feels like it's trying to impress. These could include long descriptions or extra flourishes or dialogue that sounds a little too perfect, or sentences that feel clever but slow the reader down. Ask yourself if those moments are serving the character or serving the writer. Because if they're serving the writer, try something different. Simplify the line. Bring the focus back to the character's perception. Let the moment unfold without commentary. More often than not, the scene will become stronger. Because fiction isn't about demonstrating how skillfully we can manipulate language. It's about storytelling. It's about allowing readers to step inside another human experience. And that experience becomes far more powerful when the language supports it instead of competes with it. The most memorable stories aren't the ones where readers remember how clever the writing was. They're the ones where readers remember how they felt reading it. So trust the character's voice. Trust emotional clarity. Trust the natural rhythm of perception. And if a sentence feels like it's trying a little too hard to impress someone, it probably is. Let it go. Because the goal of storytelling isn't to be clever. The goal is to be true. And truth, when it's written with clarity and restraint and emotion, will always resonate more deeply than cleverness ever could.